We will have a different future, a brighter future, rooted in democracy and principles, hope and light, of decency and dignity, of freedom and possibilities. For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power.
Those comments by President Biden yesterday in Warsaw, Poland, pushing the White House into cleanup mode once again. The administration insists he was not calling for a regime change in Russia, but critics are ripping into the president, saying his words are dangerous. Let's bring in New York Republican Congressman Lee Zeldin, a member of the House Financial Services and Foreign Affairs Committees and candidate for New York governor. Just give us off the top of your head your thoughts on what the president had to say and the overall tone of the speech, Congressman.
Here we go. It happened again. I mean, we all remember the minor incursion green lighting that the White House had to immediately try to clean up before Putin decided to invade Ukraine in the first place. We've seen it with Vice President Harris during her travels. Words matter. When you're the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief, you're the Vice President of the United States, you can't be saying this stuff off the cuff. Your job is to de-escalate, not escalate. You have to be effective and consistent. Being strong is important for a leader, but in this case, these are words that cause an escalation when everyone else is trying to end this conflict.
I find it especially curious that the United States still has not green-lighted the delivery of those Soviet-era MiG-29s from Poland to Ukraine because they're afraid of angering Vladimir Putin. And yet, when the president uses language like that, one could only think that it would anger Vladimir Putin.
Correct. And these are tools, resources that Ukraine is requesting in order to be able to defend itself. These are for defensive purposes. These are to maintain the territorial sovereignty of their country and to make sure that the Ukrainian flag is still flying over Kyiv. So there's help that keeps coming to Ukraine from the United States and others that I would say is less effective than if it had come earlier. And here we are once again, you have support that's being identified that others want to provide to Ukraine. You don't want to stand in the way of that. This help is of the most use for Ukraine the earlier that it's able to get it. It's the same thing on the sanctions front as we talk about additional tools that may be available for the rest of the world, United States included, to ramp up pressure on Russia. If you want to have any type of deterrent effect or to change behavior, there's no sense of waiting longer. If it's something that you've identified that we should be doing, let's get it done.
Most observers that I've been reading about today, or people I've talked to, thought the speech was pretty good until that last line, which they found was a little bit frightening. It may go a long way to explain why the president's poll numbers are so low right now. In fact, in an NBC News poll, they are as low as they've ever been, 40% approval rating for the president right now.
We're not surprised by these numbers, especially because of the pain at the pump, the supply chain crisis, inflation, numbers skyrocketing 7.9% in February. The economic dynamic here is one that has a whole lot of people who aren't partisan. I would call these Americans, average, everyday, non-political Americans who are upset about the economic policy. When you tack onto it the stories that might be coming from a weakened southern border crisis, the stories that come from last August in Afghanistan, where we end up executing this fatally flawed withdrawal from there, and then on the 6-month mark of when the United States withdrew from our embassy in Kabul, we spent it withdrawing from our embassy in Kyiv. And we are mostly proud Americans concerned about foreign policy. Some people may not be paying as much attention to what's going on elsewhere around the world. And then when you see a sanction like, for example, cutting off Russian oil imports, we don't want to see the administration going towards Iran or Venezuela. The average American says, hey, this is a great opportunity to look at our own energy policy, ramp up domestic energy production, become energy independent again. So I would say that the common sense solutions that many Americans are identifying themselves but not seeing with their leaders in government is adding to the frustration and also adding to his disapproval numbers.
Yeah, we were a net exporter of petroleum products a couple of years ago. Now we are buying oil, or have been buying oil, even from the Russians. And after canceling those deals, we're turning to countries like Venezuela to buy our oil. wouldn't it simply make sense to do more drilling in this country? I mean, if you're going to burn the oil, burn the petroleum products, it might as well be American, shouldn't it?
No question about it. Here in New York State, where I represent the 1st Congressional District, we have, in some of our regions of the state, we sit on the Marcellus and Utica shales. We can be safely extracting this resource. We can be greenlighting pipeline applications that are sitting at some state capitals or the federal government. And this all can drive us towards ramping up domestic energy production that can also create jobs and improve the economy. It can improve our economic security as well as our physical security, because we're not relying on adversaries elsewhere. The hardest part of it for proud Americans is knowing just how much resource that we have here domestically. And it wasn't that long ago that it seemed like the federal government had our back in identifying those solutions and aggressively pursuing them. But here, what we're seeing, like, for example, in New York, they're finalizing a state budget where they're proposing to ban all gas hookups on new construction statewide, after New York City recently did that as well. AOC and her friends, with de Blasio's help, they cut off a new pipeline application that would have delivered natural gas. So this is something that falls on the federal government, also state and local governments. We should look at this as an opportunity when we're cutting off Russian oil imports.
The Ukrainian Speaker of the Parliament says that Ukraine is essentially acting as a buffer against Russian aggression toward NATO nations. Listen.
Ukraine is shielding NATO's eastern flank. If Russia is allowed to succeed in Ukraine, it will move to attack other European country. And you know that Russian officials are already talking about the need to destroy Poland and the Baltic states after Ukraine.
Destroy Poland and the Baltic states. That would be that would invoke Article 5 of the NATO treaty. The United States would have to respond if that were the case. It seems critical that the Ukrainians win this war. So why does the White House not do more? Like, for instance, allowing the delivery of those Polish jets?
I agree with that point that Vladimir Putin wants to put more of the Soviet Union back together again. He looks at this as a long-term legacy item, a goal of his. He clearly overshot his target here. He thought that he was going to be able to take over Ukraine in as little as one day. Obviously, that's not going to happen. But for the United States, we need to always be making decisions of what we feel are in the best interests of the United States of America. When you analyze that reality, that Vladimir Putin is looking to go elsewhere, this doesn't stop in just invading the territorial sovereignty of Ukraine. It really reminds all of us to take inventory of our various instruments of national power, but also to execute these options in a way that are geared solely towards de-escalation, not escalation. But we have to have eyes wide open, because Putin has a bigger and scarier long game than just going into Ukraine.
New York Congressman Lee Zeldin. Congressman, thank you.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.